Hey everybody, today is Monday, January 3rd, 2022. Coming up on the show today, author of the book Cut to the Monkey, editor Roger Nygard.
While I was working on the show, one of the other editors came up to me and said, "How do you cut comedy as opposed to drama? Because there are differences." This is a Larry David quote. When I think about doing another season of Curb Your Enthusiasm, it's not the writing that's daunting, it's the editing. Don't be an editor who cuts films, be a filmmaker who edits. You're going to be so much more able to attack a scene if you understand story structure.
Yes, all that and a lot more on this edition of The Rough Cut. Okay, 2022. Got to take a little getting used to saying that. And writing that. Hey, as long as we're talking about writing things, a guest from Rough Cut Past, editor Roger Nygard, has written a book. Yeah, sometimes editors write books. And not just any book. A book about editing comedy. And I figured we should start off 2022. See, I'm still working on it. We should start off 2022 with a few laughs. More importantly, we should start off by learning how to make some laughs in the cutting room. And something that has come up more than once during the interviews we've done over the past few years is that editing comedy is not something to be taken lightly. In fact, it is where many an angelic editor fears to tread. And why is that? Why is cutting comedy so hard, and why are so many editors trepidatious about taking on comedy projects? Well, that is a topic best left to an expert, and Roger Nygard can surely be considered one. Last time he was on the podcast, it was with editor Stephen Rash, Roger's co-editor on Curb Your Enthusiasm. So right there, you know Roger has some serious chops when it comes to cutting not-so-serious material. Then you have shows like VEEP, Crashing, Grey's Anatomy, which has its funny moments, and The Mind of the Married Man. In addition to editing comedy, Roger is also a director and a documentary filmmaker, which is a theme that comes up in his book, the importance of being a filmmaker first if you want to be a better editor. The book is called Cut to the Monkey, a Hollywood editor's behind-the-scenes secrets to making hit comedies. Inside, you will find tons of interviews with big names from the world of comedy, Larry David, as you would expect, and also Sacha Baron Cohen, Judd Apatow, Julie Louis-Dreyfus, as well as editors and showrunners from big comedy movies and TV series. But I think what I like most about the book is that it's not just philosophies about editing comedy, it's also practical approaches and techniques that you can apply in the editing room to finding the best takes and then making them even better. And I'd go so far to say that much of this can be applied to editing in general and not just comedy. So we're going to explore some of these great philosophies and techniques with Roger in just a moment. But first, some important things you need to know whether you're funny or not. Hey, you know what's not funny? Data breaches. I mean, I guess breaches on its own is kind of funny, but data breaches are not funny, and they are something that is all too common in entertainment, which is why Massive Transfer is your best bet to safely share media files in less time than other providers. Massive, spelled M-A-S-V, is a secure file transfer solution that can move terabytes of data over the cloud. And as a member of the Trusted Partner Network's vendor roster, Massive is a proven service that protects against those data breaches. You don't need a subscription to sign up or a complicated IT setup. You just pay as you go at 25 cents per gigabyte. So sign up for Massive today using massive.io/the-rough-cut and get 100 gigabytes free towards your transfer. Once again, that's massive.io/the-rough-cut for 100 gigabytes free. I would also love to tell you a little bit about our friends at Extreme Music. And while I am doing that, let's get back to Curb Your Enthusiasm a little bit. You know, the music on that show, it's almost like a character unto itself. The music really is a part of the comedy of that show. So that ought to tell you how important great music is in making your show or movie a hit. And Extreme Music has a seemingly limitless catalog of music from the biggest and best names in production audio. Their website makes it simple to navigate this catalog by letting you search on practically any musical or lyrical keyword so that you can find just what your story needs. And then they go another level deeper by letting you customize the track right down to the stems. That is huge. It is free to try out, and you can take care of all the licensing right there online or with a little help from one of their reps at a location near you. So when you make your next show or movie, make it sound great with a little help from Extreme Music. All right then, it is time to learn a little and time to laugh a little with editor, filmmaker, and author Roger Nygard. Roger, there's a lot of questions you can ask an author, but I think the most important one to start with is why. I mean, writing a book is no small undertaking, and you keep fairly busy in your day-to-day job as an editor of great comedies. So what was it that prompted you to write this book?
Well, two things happened. One, I was working on Grey's Anatomy, and I was hired by Krista Vernoff because she was looking for someone who had some experience in comedy, editing comedy, because she wanted to take season 14 of Grey's Anatomy back toward its comedy roots. If you look at the earlier seasons, there's a lot of humor in Grey's Anatomy, and over ensuing seasons, it got more and more about blood and guts and serious stories. So because she wanted to steer it back, she hired me. And while I was working on the show, one of the other editors came up to me and said, "How do you cut comedy as opposed to drama? Because there are differences." And so I thought, okay, I wrote him a list of 8 or 10 things. Well, keep in mind wide shots. Comedy is in the wide shot because you want to see body language. Then you can see how awkwardly someone is standing. There's a lot of information in body language. Whereas in drama, close-up is the thing. You want to see the emotion in the face and the eyes. And so if it's a funny scene, maybe favor the wider coverage. And I gave him that list, and then I thought, I should just keep going. And I kept writing ideas and thoughts down. And the other thing that happened is, while doing that, it occurred to me, while working on shows like Curb Your Enthusiasm and Who is America and Crashing with Judd Apatow and Sacha Baron Cohen and Larry David, all these people, I thought, I've got these people trapped in a room with me who have this comedy brilliance. I should interrogate them and ask them, what are the secrets to comedy? So I combined that with my own thoughts, and I collected, luckily I was able to get them all to talk, and I collected their insights and then began coalescing it into some kind of a readable cookbook. I wanted to make an editor's cookbook. Like, this is how you edit, not just comedy, but in general, and specifically comedy, which is trickier than drama. It's harder to do comedy because it's obvious to everyone when something's not funny. You can tell when it's not funny. With drama, you can slide more. It's still dramatic, even if it's sloppy or not. It's a little looser. The rules aren't quite as rigid, and you can get by with more. So that's the background, and cut to 2 years later, and I had a book done.
Well, every editor has a process for how they build a scene. You just mentioned how, like, hey, I've got Larry David trapped in a room with me. Let's get some great anecdotes from him. But once you have all that material, what is your process for how you build a book? And how did you, over time, what were the big building blocks that you moved around to make a more cohesive and ultimately a very enjoyable book?
Well, the system that I've developed for editing in general and comedy in specific is I start from the back. I work backwards. I start with the last take, or usually the last wider coverage that they arrived at before they moved on to the tighter coverage. A lot of shows now, obviously, they use multiple cameras, and so they don't worry so much about shooting all sizes because they've got many cameras going at once. But like on VEEP, they would shoot a round of wider coverage. Once they got the scene, then they'd move in for a round of tighter coverage with all the cameras. So I would start with the last good take because they probably arrived at what they liked there and build the scene from that one take. And now I've got that framework to try to improve everything. I'm going to try to improve every line and go backwards in time and look at each take. And the reason I start at the end is because if I started at the beginning and built my first version of the scene, I would have to replace 95% of it because they haven't quite gotten there yet. But if I start at the end, I'm only replacing maybe 60%. That way I can move faster. And it's a system that has worked for me. It's not everyone does that. I talked to Stephen Rash and included his thoughts in the book. He's my other Curb Your Enthusiasm comrade. He starts from the beginning and prefers to go through and grab the pieces he likes and work from beginning to end. So it's not a hard and fast rule, and we both get it done, and we both get there. But that's what works for me and gets me there faster. And I keep talking about speed, which is so important, obviously, because producers want to get done quicker and their deadlines are always coming. And when I interviewed with Chris Divernoff for Grey's Anatomy, one of the questions she asked me was, "Are you fast?" And I said, well, I'm sure there are a lot of people out there who can push the buttons faster than me. I'm not a speed metal guitarist at the keyboard necessarily, but nobody's going to pick the right takes faster than me. And speed is really a matter of making fewer mistakes. So that's how I get there faster. Starting at the end, I have fewer choices to make, and that means fewer mouse clicks.
Cut to the Monkey is a clever name for a book, not just a book on editing comedy. But for those wondering what the real meaning is behind the punchy title, what do you have to say to them besides, hey, buy my book, you won't regret it?
Early in my career, when I was working on my early films, my documentaries, Trekkies, and I made an action picture called American Yakuza 2, back to back. And one of the things that I realized was, I mean, every editor realizes you need something to cut to save yourself in a lot of scenes. You can't, how do I get from A to C? There's no B. You need a cutaway. And just as a funny thought, it occurred to me, and I was talking to Joel Soisson, who is one of the producers of Trekkies and has written and produced probably 45 films, a lot of horror films. It's the idea that whenever you look at a monkey, no matter what it's doing, it's always entertaining. You can always cut to a monkey because they're always going to be funny at any given moment. So that's the perfect cutaway. But it could be a baby, it could be a cell phone, could be any reaction from someone in the scene, the TV screen. The basic idea of the cutaway gets you through a scene when you're in trouble. There's a movie called The Miracle of Morgan's Creek, one of Preston Sturges's great films. And I noticed when I was watching that, he shot a lot of oneers in that movie. And a oneer, of course, is trying to play a whole scene in one take, or maybe several lines. And I noticed that at one point when they're walking down the street talking, this couple, that suddenly we cut to a close-up of the woman and then cut back out to the wide shot again. She doesn't say a line, it's just a quick cutaway so that he can cut between two different oneers because he obviously boxed himself in and he didn't like the beginning of one and the ending of the other. And so in order to put the two together, he had to make an optical blow-up out of the existing oneer and create an insert or a close-up that didn't exist, just so he could cut. You know, I'm sure he would have loved to have had a monkey in the background that he could have cut to at any given moment, but he didn't have it. So he and I noticed that and pulled stills from that in the book to show how even the masters have boxed themselves in the past and looked for a way out.
Well, so by extension, is the era of high-res filmmaking, 4K and 8K cameras, has that been a boon for comedy editors just for the reframing aspects of it?
Oh, my goodness, yes. We have a conversation every other day in the editing room about, okay, should we pull the 6K master and create a blow-up here so we can fix this this issue of trying to get from here to there and we've kind of stuck? If you want to cut out 3 or 4 lines, and especially if people are moving around and you can't get from here to there, you got to get creative. And technology has increased our ability to do that now.
Editing comedy is widely regarded as being one of the most difficult jobs to take on. I have my own theories on that, but I would love to hear from you why you think that is.
I asked Larry David and Sacha and Judd Apatow about that, and they all said that for them, the hardest part of the process, like Larry said, this is a Larry David quote, when I think about doing another season of Curb Your Enthusiasm, it's not the writing that's daunting, it's the editing. And that's because that's where the show comes together. It's the hardest part it's the final rewrite of the script. You're revising and rewriting and recreating from the raw material of what was shot. The script is an ideal. The footage that you shoot are like the ingredients. And then the editing is when the chef goes to work and creates the final piece, the final meal. And so you need a good chef, as well as a good cinematographer and a good writer and a good director. And comedy is difficult because, it seems obvious and it's kind of an old cliche, but timing is everything. If you're off by a few frames, sometimes it's not funny. And I'll give you a specific example of one of the tips in the book. If you want a scene to be funnier, feature the punchline. Do not cut away from the person's face who is delivering the punchline until they complete the final syllable of the last word in the sentence of the punchline. I had made a mistake once where I cut away before the punchline was finished when I was working on my first TV series, The Mind of the Married Man. And Mike Binder caught me and said, "What are you doing? You can't cut away before the punchline." And I was trying to match continuity, right? Something else editors do, but comedy takes precedence. And so it's not as funny if you cut away before it's over. The brain doesn't recognize as strongly the landing of this punchline if you're off the face. So to make a punchline land as strongly as possible, you want a shot that's centered on the face, not a side angle, closer, not a wide angle, and you want to stay there until it's over. Maybe it sounds simple, but it is kind of simple. And if you do it, the scene gets funnier. And if you don't, the scene is less funny.
Well, there's a theme you go back to at different times throughout the book, and that is to not just be an editor, but to be a filmmaker. Can you explain what you mean by that distinction, and why is it so important if your ultimate goal is to be a great editor of comedies?
Yeah, that's definitely a very basic theme of the book. And I believe this because once I started talking to the other editors I know, I realized we all had something in common. Stephen Rash, John Korn, Ivan Ladizinski, we were all filmmakers before we were editors, starting at a young age. I was about 7 or 8 when I first discovered my dad's 8mm camera, and I immediately started shooting zany little sketches and comedies and funny videos in college. In high school, I moved to Super 8. College, moved to video, and it doesn't really matter the format. What matters is that you're practicing your craft. You know, my projects got a little more sophisticated over time, not much, but my thesis is that don't be an editor who cuts films, be a filmmaker who edits. You're going to be so much more able to attack a scene if you understand story structure, and you understand cinematography, and you understand at least the basics of what it means in each of the categories that surrounds editing, particularly writing and understanding story, because producers are relying on the editor to bring solutions. They want you to bring ideas. They don't want you to just to be good at the software. Hey, I learned the software, I'm an editor. That is 15% of it. I'm terrible at software. I've learned it, and I learned what I need to learn. But most of my education and experience has gone into making films, making short films when I was younger, then making documentaries, making feature films. And I really gravitated towards editing. Editing has won my heart. I love it more than anything else, and that's what I do the most. That's why I'm an editor. But I'm also a filmmaker, and I still make films to this day.
Well, as far as teaching someone to edit, and by extension, editing comedy, there's the belief that you can teach someone how to use an editing system, as you said, and even how to develop a system, a method for editing. But to be a truly gifted editor, that has to come from within. You have to have not only a great sense of timing, but also an understanding of the human condition, human emotions. Your book offers up a lot of great best practices to being a better editor of comedy, which I'm definitely going to ask you more about, but also some great suggestions on things that you can do, things you can study outside of learning filmmaking and editing techniques. So what are your suggestions when it comes to that aspect of being a more complete editor?
I thought about that too. What if I could go back and do college all over again, what would I do differently? And the first thing that occurred to me when I was in college, because when I was in college, I was already interested in being a filmmaker. And I thought, okay, as a filmmaker or as a director, as a writer, I really need to understand the world. So I took a wide range of classes in liberal arts. So everything helps, but what I wish I had done more of in college was study more literature. I wish I had read more of the classics and learned more about that. And it didn't occur to me at the time just how crucial it was to a filmmaker to understand writing and story, and especially the classics, because as a filmmaker, as a writer, you're allowed to go and take Shakespeare and copy it and remake it. It's in the public domain. Everything after, I think, 1928 right now, before 1928 is in the public domain. After, it's not necessarily, and so, you can't borrow so freely from newer works, but Chaucer or Plato, Aristotle, all the way up through Mark Twain, you can borrow liberally and learn from them, and they did too. Shakespeare borrowed from everything that came before him. He wasn't creating his stories out of nowhere. And so we're all influenced by what's around us, especially if you allow yourself to be, which means learning about the world around you. So I guess the short answer to that is don't just study how to operate equipment. That's important, but you really need to become a rounded person with a point of view, because a film is a thesis statement. It's an idea. It's a gripe. It's a grievance that you have that you're expressing to the world. Whatever the issue is, it's usually bundled up in a narrative and presented in an entertaining way so that audiences learn. The best movies teach you a lesson. There's like Star Trek, the original Star Trek. Every episode was a morality tale that had a moral at the end. But if I told you, or someone told me, hey, I'm going to show you this film or this documentary that's going to teach you something, I couldn't fall asleep fast enough. But if they said, hey, here's this really entertaining movie, you've got to see it, and there happened to be a lesson underneath it, I'll happily learn that lesson while I'm being entertained. And that's what you have to do as a filmmaker and as an editor. The editor is making sure that the pacing is choreographed just so that you don't lose the audience. So the entertainment value never dips below a certain level. Because if it does, they're on to something else. And it's your job to make sure that never happens.
Well, hearing you talk about going back and reading the classics reminded me of, I said I had some theories about editing comedy. People fear doing it. And I think the reason that is there's a direct correlation between being funny, the ability to get a joke and to craft a joke, and intellect. And I think that's something people fear is, if I can't edit comedy, if I don't get the jokes with the showrunner I'm working with, that's an indictment on my own intellect.
Absolutely. Intelligence is at the basis of good comedy. And why is that? I took some time in the book to try to dissect, well, what does it mean? What is comedy? What does it mean to be funny? What is funny? Is this funny? I noticed when I was editing the Comedy Store documentary, the Showtime docuseries, Jay Leno constantly says to people, is this funny? And he'll try out jokes on them. And what is it? What is funny? So I identified what's at the basis of something that makes us laugh. And I asked all these experts to help me do that. And there are some basic things, elements. And one is, and this is the first thing that came up, Judd Apatow said, it's always about creating surprise or suddenly moving in a direction that an audience doesn't expect. You want to surprise people. Audiences love to be surprised. They don't want to predict what's going to happen next. It has to make sense and follow logically, but it has to be a surprise. The next thing, Mike Binder put it this way, when he's writing a script, he said one of his goals is to have an audience reaction be, wow, I didn't expect the character to say that, and it's true. That's a double win, surprise and truth. What is a punchline? It's often just a statement of truth, because individually and as a society, we spend a lot of energy trying to suppress the truth, because truth is a bitch. And the best comedians, like Mort Saul, he didn't invent the idea, but he really worked it, that he would just stand up and start telling the truth about people and politicians. And it was funny. In the Comedy Store documentary, in the outtakes, it didn't make the final cut, but Whitney Cummings said that when she's writing comedy, her secret is to just tell the truth. She asks herself, what's the elephant in the living room? What's the thing you weren't allowed to say when you were growing up? The taboo things, the things that are off limits, and the things we all experience but keep in the shadows. That's where the meat of her comedy is. So understanding that, sometimes when you're diagnosing why isn't this joke landing, you might realize, oh, it's not truthful. It's missing the mark. Steve Allen, who was the first host of The Tonight Show in 1954, I think is the first one to say this famous line, tragedy plus time equals comedy. And that's the third element of comedy. The more it hurts, the funnier it gets. There's almost nothing funnier than watching somebody bump their head or fall down. You laugh because you're glad it's not you. And man, that must have hurt.
This is true.
So surprise, truth, and pain are the top three. And I list several other things in the book that make up the concoction, the formula for comedy. And an editor, in general, because drama has comedy, moments of comedy in it, funny lines, but specifically comedy editors really need to understand what is comedy if you're going to try to fix it, if you're trying to present it, you're trying to provide solutions. And so that was another part of the goal that I had in writing the book.
Well, throughout the book, you share anecdotes and insights from people highly regarded in the world of comedy, both in front of the lens and in the editing room. Creators like Larry David, Sacha Baron Cohen, Judd Apatow, writers and performers like Julia Louis-Dreyfus, Brad Hall, you just mentioned Whitney Cummings, Mike Binder. You have a multitude of talented showrunners, and of course, Stephen Rash, your editorial partner in crime on Curb. And throughout all those interviews, there are a lot of different films and TV shows that are cited as being influential. But one that comes up time and again is Monty Python and the films and TV show created by that troupe. So why do you suppose that is, and what can you learn? What can a young person who's about to embark on a career in cutting comedy learn from Monty Python?
Yeah, isn't that funny? I guess I wasn't surprised in hindsight, but as it was happening, I was going, wow, everybody from my era essentially was influenced by many things, but one thing is Monty Python. Jeff Schaefer said that when he was young, They had a Betamax player in his family, and so he got the videos of Monty Python and the Holy Grail and Monty Python's The Meaning of Life, and he watched them over and over again, and he wrote down the script by hand to each of these movies, just so he could have it, because you couldn't get scripts. He couldn't get scripts then. And the thing about Monty Python is, and any filmmaker should go back and watch Monty Python's Flying Circus, the original TV series, to see and absorb why this was so influential and groundbreaking. But it was a style of comedy, I guess you could call it a surrealistic comedy. And what they did is similar to what the Marx Brothers did, another comedy troupe that came up time and again. Larry David was influenced by the Marx Brothers. Judd Apatow was influenced by the Marx Brothers. What they did, the Marx Brothers and what Monty Python does, is they punch upward. It's easy to make fun of people below you, but it's much more satisfying to see these guys, to see these troops, the comedians, making fun of the people above us. The queen, the magistrate, the judge, the lawyer, the policeman, all these people in power above us. That's who they took on and made fun of. And that really resonates with an audience. And that's one of the reasons. But also the Pythons are just so funny. It's so brilliant. There are very few things that have made me laugh harder than any given Monty Python sketch. They become the touchstone. Alec Berg said that he often refers in writers' rooms to Monty Python sketches as, oh yeah, that's a dead parrot. What's a dead parrot? Well, anyone who's watched Monty Python knows there's a very famous sketch about John Cleese trying to return a parrot to a pet shop because the parrot is dead. And it's hysterical. So yes, if you're a filmmaker and an editor, you'd be wise to go back and enjoy some early Monty Python work.
Well, when young editors and filmmakers are starting out, they generally have a pretty clear idea, or at least they think they do, in mind as to what they want to be. You know, maybe they want to direct or produce or edit, and maybe the field they want to work in is blockbuster Marvel movies or dialogue-driven character studies or comedy TV series or films. And the thinking is often that you have to start out at the bottom of any one of those things. Like if I want to be a feature film editor, I've got to be a PA, I've got to be an editorial assistant in feature film. And that's not always realistic because there are far more jobs available in unscripted television. Or if you're just starting out, it might be in doing promos or trailers or commercials. So what can you learn from other types of storytelling that can help you on your way to being a working comedy editor?
Yeah, well, if you want to be the best, or if you want to be really good, at least if you want to compete with the people who are out there that are competing for the same jobs, you need to be as good as them or better. And the way to become as good or better is to practice in all these different arenas, not just the one that you're going to specialize in. So you should make a short film. You should practice. Make a little sketch comedy short or a short documentary or a feature length if you have the wherewithal. But if you don't, make a 1-minute film and practice shooting these different things. I've worked in documentaries, features, action, commercials, and by doing so, learning in the different disciplines informs each discipline, and it brings back more solutions as an editor when I'm sitting at the keyboard working with somebody else's footage. I didn't come up through the assistant route. I came up through making films and then getting noticed. My film Suckers, which is about a comedy about car salesmen, comedy drama, was screening at a film festival in Aspen, Colorado, and Mike Binder happened to be there, and he was at the screening, and he saw the film, and he was impressed by the editing of a comedy, because it's very difficult to find good comedy editors. And so he offered me a job. And that's when I turned pro and started working for other people on his TV series, The Mind of the Married Man. And that led to other opportunities, and the fact that I had made Trekkies and my other documentaries has gotten me work. That's what got me Curb Your Enthusiasm, because they felt that my experience working in the documentary world would be helpful to working on a show with improvised dialogue, where you're building something, you're building a scene out of your own thoughts and ideas. It's not all laid out for you as it is like on a circle takes show like Grey's Anatomy.
Well, I mentioned that the book offers up some real best practices and techniques that can help you as an editor. Again, that's one of the reasons I loved it. It's not just high-level theories and not just interviews. It's real good best practices. And one framework that you've developed to present these things, and you've touched on it a little bit already without calling it out by name, is the periodic table of nonsense. And within that periodic table, you have, and the first three you've talked about already, surprise, truth, pain, but then absurdity, contrast, language, abnormal behavior, which is probably my favorite, reproduction, and then finally do it faster. So we could never truly do it justice here to go through the periodic table of nonsense, which is why people should definitely go get your book so they can really dig into it. But can you touch on the thinking behind some more of those elements of this table?
Well, we should certainly talk about the rule of faster comedy is funnier comedy. When I'm editing a scene, the right pace is often faster than what felt right to the writer or the director or the actors on the set. You have to get to the punchlines cleaner and quicker than they did. Good writing is concise writing, and the same holds true for dialogue. But I don't cut fast just for the sake of speed. The idea is to speed things up until the pace feels appropriate. If you cut fast just to be faster, that's a sign that you've lost control of the scene. And you're there's a problem with the material, and you're trying to hold people's attention just by cutting faster. You want a scene to breathe sometimes. I try never to cut whenever possible. I try to make as few edits as possible. But I cut a lot, and I cut aggressively because I'm fixing a lot of dialogue. So when I can hold on a take and not cut, I love to do that. Now, why is faster comedy funnier comedy? An audience likes to have their entertainment, their media presented to them in a certain way. Otherwise, you lose them. And one of the signs of an amateur editor, in my opinion, is if I'm watching something and we're on a reaction shot or something that is not the person who's speaking. We're watching anything but the person speaking at the moment, and so the dialogue is underneath the visual. If I hear an or a or a look or a listen or a pause, there's absolutely no reason for that to be there if we're on a reaction shot, because you have total control of the audio if it's not sync sound. So I pull out all the pauses, all the word baggage, and get rid of it all so that if there's a cleaner, straighter, quicker line between the setups and the punchlines. Once the setup is laid down, and what is a setup? It's an explanation of a premise. Once the audience understands the premise, then you can do the punchline. And if they don't fully understand the premise, the punchline will not land as strongly. So I focus on making sure the setup is delivered cleanly and concisely. Then I remove any unnecessary tangents or mistakes, mispronunciations, in order to get to that punchline as fast as possible. Now, Curb Your Enthusiasm, of course, is all about tangents. And so we keep the really funny ones, but I cut a lot of them out. So that A-plus punchline, which is the most important thing in that scene or that moment, will land as strongly as possible. There was an interesting theory that Alec Berg told me, who's a showrunner of TV shows like Barry and Silicon Valley, and I met him on Curb Your Enthusiasm. He said that to him, comedy is almost, it's mathematical. And an A-plus punchline is not twice as funny as a B-plus punchline. It's 10 times funnier. It's logarithmic. And so what he does is he curates these A-plus laughs. And sometimes that means sacrificing a lot of B-plus laughs in order to make sure that the big laugh lands. And movies that have 4, 5, 6, 7 really big laughs, A-plus laughs, are far more memorable and become classics than a movie with 100 B-plus laughs that never gets to an A-plus level. Those are more forgettable. And you might not even tell people about it. But those big laugh movies, you tell your friends. And that's how word of mouth builds. And you get to those A-plus laughs by getting there faster, and you speed up the pacing, and you deliver the information faster and cleaner. And Steve Rash put it this way: if you're writing a term paper in college and you just remove all the bad stuff, even if it's not the most brilliant term paper, it gets better. And it's the same with comedy. If you just editing in one sense is just removing all the stuff that's not quite A+, so that you're left with all the best material, and it just gets better.
The interviews you do in the book are all with people you've had a working creative relationship. You would assume you know them and their unique approaches to their craft pretty well already. But was there anything any one of them said to you during the course of your interviews that surprised you or challenged any preconceived notions that you had from actually working with them?
Oh, constantly. And I mean, one example is Ivan Ladizinski, who is the editor who was at the beginning of Survivor, worked on the pilot and essentially helped develop what Survivor's style became. I met him when we were both working in editing rooms next door to each other. I was cutting my action picture back to back, and he was cutting an action picture called Drive early in our careers. And he went on to do Survivor. And I interviewed him, and I asked him, what is his most basic philosophy of editing? And he said, The footage tells me what to do. And I thought, oh yeah, of course, that's right. Because the script is a goal. And the footage is really what matters, not what's in the script. What matters is what you actually have to work with. And I thought that's so true. I mean, oftentimes when I'm working on a TV show, I will cut a scene without even reading the script. I want to feel a fresh impression from the footage. And so I'll know how the audience might feel when they get a fresh experience. And I try to remember my original experience about how funny this line was, or how effective a line delivery was. And when I'm putting the scene together, all that really matters is what's the footage in front of me. So my process then is similar to, I realized it was similar to Ivan's, that I dive into a scene, put the scene together the best way I can with what's there. Then I'll go and read the scene very closely to see if I missed anything and make some changes. But he had so concisely summed up what the process is, and that was a nice surprise. That was fun.
One of the things that really comes through in the book is that, one really big aspect of how you can make a scene funnier is through sound. In fact, it may be the biggest aspect, at least in terms of the actual things you can do to manipulate the comedic impact of a joke. At a high level, what are some of the things that an editor can do with sound to make something funnier?
Yeah, I listen to the sound and I cut a scene based on the sound first. I don't even really think about the visual while I'm putting my first cut together. And Stephen Rash is the same way, I discovered. He'll sometimes, when he's first putting a scene together, isn't even looking at the screen. He's just listening. Because that's where the performance is. It's in the soundtrack. And we're selecting the best performance first. Once we've laid out all of our best takes and we've got all the scene assembled, then I'll start looking at the visual and make sure that the scene flows elegantly and establishes the location with a wide shot somewhere early on and follows the requirements of a good scene. But I'm really listening to the performance. And I asked some of the showrunners I worked with, and in comedy, they all agreed. Jeff Schaffer said to him, it's all about the sound. He can listen in an editing room. He can sit in the editing room with his eyes closed and give his notes to you on what to do next, because he's listening for pacing, for performance, for is this joke landing? And then, he'll open his eyes. We'll both open our eyes and make sure that it flows visually. But comedy is primarily in the soundtrack. Of course, there are visual gags and sight gags, and not to discount those. But often, those are more like ornaments that you're hanging on the line, which is created by the soundtrack.
You used a term in the book that I admit I hadn't heard before, and that is a swingle. So if you could explain what a swingle is and what kind of problems that poses for an editor, and possibly any ways you might be able to get around those problems that derive from a swingle.
Yeah, I first encountered the term swingle on VEEP, where they do a lot of panning from one character to the other between lines. And it's a conjunction of swinging single, a shortened, or we're going to do some swingles, and this is the swingles take, or this is the swingles camera. And I'll do a lot of cutting during the swish pan between takes, so I can use the beginning of one take and the ending of another take. You can hide and edit in that swish. I mean, I'm brazenly looking for ways to cut out frames, and so I'll take out time during the swishes. I'll sometimes just pull frames out, because you don't need the whole swish. I can shorten it, and nobody notices. You can bury the edit, and when I get away with it, it's buried. If I can see it, then I'll back off.
When you're working with Larry David or Sacha Baron Cohen or Judd Apatow, just right there, three really huge names in the world of comedy, yet they're still counting on you, Roger Nygard, editor, to voice an opinion and often show them ways something could be even funnier. A major element to how successful an editor is how diplomatic they can be in the cutting room while still being, I guess the word I would use is authentic. You have to know when to push and when to relent. And that bit of advice that editors give so often to up-and-comers, you got to be diplomatic, got to be good in the room, can be really hard for people to ingest because you can't really quantify it. Yet I'm going to ask you to try and do that. How did you learn to be good in the room? And have there been any lessons you learned the hard way on your journey to being a very accomplished comedy editor?
Yeah, great editors shut the fuck up.
That should have been on the book cover.
That's a good alternate title. You're right. Your chance to make your case was the editor's cut. I present, here's my best take on the footage. Now it's up to the director and then the producer to give their input. And it's pointless to defend your choices. It's a waste of time to defend why you did something that isn't working for them. So you just need to start trying other things. And I often find that I didn't find all the best solutions. And as Dave Mandel has put it, that's why there's you, and that's why there's not just me, doing this. We do it together. We find better solutions than either one of us could do alone. We push each other. When a producer's feeling the scene just isn't working right, they push you and you're thinking, again, we're going to take this scene apart again. And you do, and you realize, there was a better solution that we missed. And it wouldn't have gotten there if he hadn't pushed, because his instinct, or Krista Vernoff is often like that too on Grey's Anatomy. She loves editors who are willing to try 50 pieces of music to find the absolute best song instead of just throwing something in there. And that excites her. If you're an editor who gets excited by a good note, she loves that. So that's part of it, is keeping the excitement going, being willing to try anything and everything, not putting forth resistance, I guess is a good way to put it. A bad editor is resistant to change. A good editor is open to anything. Let's try it. It's non-destructive. You have buttons. You can push them and you can undo any level of undo you want. And you know what? Sometimes we come right back around to what I had in the editor's cut. They just have to see it for themselves and come to an acceptance of, okay, you know what? That was the best choice of what we have available. It's hard. It's really hard to bite your tongue sometimes, but that's your job. You've already made your point. You made your play for the best. That's not to say that sometimes they want to discuss a scene and they want your input. Judd Apatow calls making a movie and working in the editing room with an editor a 9-month discussion about a movie with somebody. You're discussing the movie for 6 months, 7 months, 8, whatever, however long it takes to finish a cut. And you try all sorts of things, and it can get exhausting, but you have to be able to deal with it and thrive in that environment where you're trying every combination. Because there's an infinite number of combinations with the footage. There's no one combination. And the producers do like it, though, when they find an editor who gets them out of the editing room sooner and faster. And that's one of the goals, and one of the editor's mottos I encountered was, get the producer out of the room as fast as possible. How do you do that? Give them what they want. and then I'm a hero when I get Larry out on the golf course early.
I bet you are. There's a well-worn axiom about editing is the final rewrite. We've all heard that a million times. And to help prove that, there's a healthy portion of the book that is devoted to good comedy writing, which makes a ton of sense. If you're going to be editing comedy, you should know more about writing comedy. But for a show like Curb Your Enthusiasm, there's a lot of improv that goes on. What would you say in terms of the value of learning improv as an editor?
Oh, I can't emphasize it enough. Stephen Rash had studied improv comedy as a performer at one point early in his career. And he credits that with helping him immensely in working as an editor. It's just about flexing different muscles, different parts of the brain, so you're not just a one-note editor. You need to be a full-fledged human being who has immersed themselves in some way in writing and or performing comedy, if possible. Don't hold yourself back. Take an improv class. It's not expensive. They're readily available in Los Angeles and New York and many cities. So you've got to push yourself a little bit because good editors tend to be loners. You have to be somewhat of an introvert to sit in a room for hours at a time by yourself and focus on editing. Extroverts are not good editors, or if you're easily distracted, it's harder for them. But introverts need to push themselves out of that rut and try some performance, taking a class, studying writing, practice performing. The more you can do, the better editor you'll be. The more varied of the approaches you take, the better you'll be. I started putting myself in my own documentaries. The first time was with my documentary, The Nature of Existence, which is an exploration of existentialism. I mean, how do you make a documentary about existentialism? It's impossible. And that's partly what attracted me to taking on the concept. But it's hilarious to me. I think it's a very funny documentary. If you don't laugh 4 times per minute during that documentary or any episode of Curb, I have failed. So that's my goal, is to make sure you're laughing out loud several times every minute. And by putting myself in the documentary, I got an appreciation for how hard it is to be an actor. It is not easy remembering lines and hitting marks. I have much more sympathy for them than I did before. It's like, oh, he missed his mark again, that jerk, No, it's like, oh, yeah, that's hard. I get it, We'll cut around it. We'll fix it. Don't worry. So the more you can learn, the more you can study, the more varied, get out of the single lane, the stronger of an editor you'll be, and the more competitive you'll be for jobs.
Well, speaking of jobs, I'd like to close out on the concept of getting jobs. Something I believe your partner in crime, Stephen Rash, said in regards to Larry David was, if you meet Larry, don't try and be funny around Larry. If you want to relate to Larry, don't try and be funny. So when you're interviewing for a job cutting comedy, is it tempting to try and be funny in the interview? And whether it is or not, is that a good idea?
Yeah, you're not going to be able to be funnier than Larry.
No.
So that's a mistake. But you got to be genuine. When you're interviewing for a job, in the back of someone's mind who's interviewing you, they're thinking, maybe subliminally, maybe it's not right at the front of their brain, but they're thinking, will I enjoy being in a room with this person for a week or 20 weeks or however long? So the secret to getting hired is to be likable. You need to make people like you. How do you do that? How do you make someone like you? Well, there's psychology on this, and the way to do that, a couple of ways. And one is flattery. I think we talked a little bit about that, but genuine flattery. Know their work. Start out any interview, any meeting with a compliment for their show, with a specific reference so they know you've seen it. Oh, that scene with the watermelon, the episode last season was amazing. It was so funny. Pick something specific and flatter their work. Now you're starting off on the right foot. And I think one reason I got the job in Curb Your Enthusiasm is because when I met Larry David, I said that I want to work with you because it's like working with one of the greats, the icons of comedy. It would be like working with Phil Silvers or Ernie Kovacs, but they're dead, and that made him laugh. But I was being truthful, and that's why it was funny. I would have loved to work with Phil Silvers. I think he's one of the funniest comedic performers in movie and television history. And it turned out that Phil Silvers was one of Larry's heroes. So I guess I scored some points with the correct flattery and the right reference. And any meeting you take, start out with a compliment for the show or their past work. Then the second thing is, I have noticed that the more they talk and the less you talk, the better your chances are. So that means don't overtalk. Answer the questions concisely and then stop talking. And ideally, end your answer with a question of your own about the show or about them, about their life. It would be nice if you can make a personal connection with whomever you're meeting with. If you walk into the room and you notice pictures of their children on the table, it's never wrong to say, oh, are those your children? They're beautiful. How old are they? See, I ended with a question. So now they're talking. And the more you get them talking, you're making a personal connection with somebody. And they see you as a nice person who's nice to be around because you're asking about them. You're interested in them. Make eye contact, listen, nod, and smile. Be an enjoyable person to be around. Think about who you enjoy being around you the most. Probably not the person who talks about themselves all the time. That's really off-putting. Even though it's an interview about you, try not to talk about yourself. Try to get them talking about themselves as much as possible in a genuine way. And that will increase your chances to make the right impression to get hired. And of course, you got to have a modicum of talent as well. But in an interview, they already know your credits, so you don't really need to brag about your work and talk about your work. They're really just, the point of an interview is to get a connection and say, hey, do I like this person? Larry David, when I asked him later, why did you hire me and, how do you hire people? He said he goes on instinct. He makes a very quick decision. My interview with Larry David was less than 5 minutes. At the end of the 5 minutes, he stood up and said to the producers, he seems fine, and walked out, and I was hired. And I found out later I was the 25th editor that they had considered for the position. They had talked to 25 people and narrowed it down to 4 or 5 that met with Larry. And he goes on gut instinct. So trust your instincts and try to shut up. Again, just shut the fuck up. And that'll do you well when you can remember that.
Words to live by. Well, in regards to flattery, even though we're not just starting our discussion and I'm not applying for a job with you, I'm going to share some of my own. It's a fantastic book for anybody listening that thinks like, wow, I know everything I need to know now. We just scratched the surface. There's so much in this book. And again, there's something for everybody. There's so much you can get out of it. There's real tangible actions you can take and things you can learn. And of course, I learned a ton. And, the best part, Roger, from here on out, when you're up, talking to a showrunner, you can say, hey, I'm Roger Nygard. I literally wrote the book on cutting comedy. And now you can say you literally heard the podcast about the book on editing comedy. What would be even better is literally reading the book on editing comedy. Big thanks to Roger for joining us today and giving us a glimpse into what his book is all about. Regarding said book, I enjoyed it and learned a lot, and I think you will too. So check out Roger's new book, Cut to the Monkey. I am sure it's available at your finer bookstores, but I've also put a link in the show notes that goes direct to Amazon to make it easier for you and to also help fund billionaire space travel. And with that, we are off and running on a new year. Let's hope it's a fun one. For now, I'll get back to work on next week's podcast, and I will do my best to make that one a fun one as well. But you be the judge and let me know what you think. Until then, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.